Hey guys, how's it going? I'm sure you could guess what we're going to be talking about today, and that's Diablo 4. And if you're anything like me, then it's been over a year since you last played D4, and you might have found yourself asking the question like I have, should I give it another shot? Now, if you've asked me this probably about 6 months ago, I would have flat out said no without a second thought. However, I've seen a ridiculous amount of changes recently going on with the game and a bunch of positive feedback from the community. So I decided, you know what? Let's give it a shot. I, like many others, originally planned on playing the absolute crap out of this game when it first released. I've been a lifelong fan of the entire Diablo series, with Diablo 2 being my first real introduction into computer gaming all the way back when I was a kid. So of course I was going to play Diablo 4. I always loved the dark and grim landscapes and all the gore and destruction that this series was known for. However, upon release, Diablo 4 definitely had its share of issues. Some were to be expected, like massive release day stress upon the servers, resulting in a multitude of players not even being able to play the game. However, the main one that really led me away was the true lack of end-game content once you finished the storyline. You essentially wandered around the world aimlessly looking for mobs, and you would occasionally do some strongholds, or you ran nightmare dungeons over and over trying to find a legendary that was actually worth something for your class or build, because 99% of the time the legendaries you did find were absolutely useless. Personally, I found that after finishing the storyline, the want to do these things really just wasn't there. The world was gorgeous and the classes really did feel unique. However, the want to actually take part in the incredibly small hamster wheel that was D4's endgame just wasn't there for me. So unfortunately, I ended up dropping the game much sooner than I would have anticipated. But now, it's been over a year, and from what I've gathered, the general perception of the game as it is right now is in a much better place than it was when I left. So I figured, what the hell? Why not give it another shot and see how things have changed? One thing I think noting about Diablo 4, and this goes for all you people watching who haven't even played it yet, the storytelling, cutscenes, and voice acting in this game is absolutely top tier.
He called out for you, wept until his tears became fire.
As far as action RPGs go, this one stands above not only every Diablo game previously, but all others in the genre. I legitimately found myself invested in the storyline and enjoyed pursuing through each act, trying to uncover the mysteries of Lilith and her demonic investment in the lands of Sanctuary. So if you've never played D4, I highly recommend it, specifically just for the chance to play through its narrative, even if the endgame grinding isn't something that is your style. So the most challenging thing about Diablo 4, and really any class-based RPG for myself, always boils down to one thing. What class am I going to play? And this time was no exception. Now, previously, when I played, I was a Wind Druid and a Shadow Rogue. So this time around, I figured it was time to get down and dirty, face to face with the legions of hell. This time, I was going to be a barbarian and hack and slash my way through the endless droves of baddies. Now, immediately upon re-entering Sanctuary, I found that they have fast-tracked the leveling experience, at least personally. Before, when I played, by the time you completed Act 1, you were roughly between the levels of 13 to 16, depending on how much of the side quests you did. But now, with skipping all the side quests, I was almost level 24 by the time I completed Act 1, which left me with a little bit of mixed feelings, because on one hand, it was awesome to really see the true scope of my character and his abilities grow so quickly. But on the other hand, I was nervous. I was nervous because if they haven't increased the endgame activity substantially, well, then you're going to reach that dead end point I talked about earlier much quicker. But I simmered down because it was much too early in my progression to worry about that yet. Now, another thing I noticed was big increases to mob density. Before, you'd very rarely ever run into groups of monsters bigger than 5 or 6. But now I was consistently finding myself running into packs of 10 plus, which I believe a lot of this has to do with why I was such a higher level compared to when I played in the past. Now, I found the storyline so entertaining that I opted to not skip the campaign, and I thoroughly enjoyed myself running through it again. But if this is something that you would feel uninterested in, especially if the story is still fresh in your memory and you just want to get in and start slaying, then the option to skip the campaign is right there after the prologue. I will say that if you're looking for the fastest way to level your character and really get into harder content, then I do recommend skipping the campaign and heading straight into the grind, as the campaign is significantly slower in leveling in comparison. It took me a couple of days to finish the storyline, as I found myself becoming immersed in the world and enjoying all the cutscenes and dialogue. But eventually, I killed Lilith and I saved the world of Sanctuary. For now. So once you complete the campaign, or you decided to opt out of it, you are then tasked with completing the capstone dungeon in Kiovashot. This is a level 50 dungeon that can be relatively difficult, especially if you're like myself and refuse to look up the strongest cookie cutter build for your character. Now, after completing this dungeon, you are then allowed access into World Tier 3, which is meant for levels 50 through 70, and then allows for the player to start receiving sacred items. Now, sacred items are enhanced versions of the same items you're used to, with increased stats that then allow you to continue slaying the now much harder enemies you'll face in World Tier 3. The same will then be said once you complete World Tier 3 and you move on to the final phase, which is, you guessed it, World Tier 4, or otherwise known as Torment. But before we get too far into the end game, I think it's time to talk about all the changes and additions that I've personally come across in my return to Diablo 4. Let me just start off by saying that they have added in a metric ton of so many different things, from a bunch of different bosses to a much needed complete rework of the crafting system that they had before. The crafting system before used to essentially be copying Diablo 3's system of salvaging unneeded rares and legendaries that you came across into materials that you could then use to re-roll attributes or affixes on the legendaries that you had that did have good stats for your build to fine-tune them into the best fit. I believe this was a good counter to antiquated systems of repeatedly farming for the same items, hoping for perfect stat rolls, but with the added caveat of the Codex of Power. Essentially, this would allow you to take the legendary affix, which is a unique effect that comes on every single legendary. Some were downright game-changing and could turn a useless build into an absolute wrecking ball, but the majority were simply just a percentage of either damage increase or a stat increase, and honestly were pretty bland, which ended up with you salvaging about 99% of the legendaries you did find, which kind of felt unintuitive. And recently they've simplified things exponentially by reworking a lot of the legendary affixes to not just be bland stat increases, as well as combining salvaging and the Codex of Power. So now as soon as you salvage an item, you would also receive its legendary affix that you can then put towards a strong rare or legendary with the good stats that you were looking for. There is also the system of tempering and masterworking, which will come further down the road as you really try to squeeze out every ounce of power out of your gear. These systems are a way of further manually selecting the perfect attributes to your gear that really will completely change the way your build plays. Overall, I feel like the crafting changes make sense, and they really take away an unneeded complexity that the initial release of Diablo 4 suffered from. Now let's talk more about the endgame. During the initial release of Diablo 4, like I mentioned earlier, after you completed the story, the only real endgame content available at the time was to essentially start farming nightmare dungeons over and over and run around the world of Sanctuary. And well, that was essentially it. However, now that is no longer the case. They've added in a multitude of different bosses and instance zones for you to truly test your build at the highest levels of difficulty. As you progress your character, you'll likely want to start off by farming Helltide zones and Nightmare dungeons in order to gather specific materials that you'll need to summon specific bosses that come with varying degrees of difficulty, ramping all the way up to incredibly challenging bosses such as Uber variants that will be the real test of if your build is truly a viable endgame contender or not. Helltide zones are randomly selected areas in the world of Sanctuary that are being assaulted by Hell's forces. The entirety of the event lasts for just shy of an hour and is essentially a massive free-for-all for you to beat the brakes off of a bunch of big angry demons. Now, as you pummel down these baddies, you'll be rewarded with cinders that then can be taken to mysterious chests that spawn all throughout the zone for gear reward. The chests come in varying degrees of quality, each requiring different amounts of cinders to open, first being 75 cinders, second 125, and third 250. There's also a meter that tracks your progress and how many of Hell's forces have died by your hand, and when full, a giant pack of angry butthurt demons will spawn on your location looking to destroy you. Overall, this provides some of the fastest gearing and leveling options in the game, and it's honestly incredibly fun, especially if you're playing with friends. Nightmare dungeons are essentially the same as they were before, a system in which they more or less copied from Mythic dungeons over in World of Warcraft if you're familiar with those, in which you get a sigil that comes in various tiers, increasing monster difficulty and adding in different mechanical affixes for you to contend with. As you complete them, they will drop increasingly better loot and a more difficult sigil to keep progressing down the line. One of my favorite activities to take part in is completing world bosses. Every couple of hours, a timer will begin to count down, letting everyone know that there will soon be a world boss spawning into the world of Sanctuary. These guys are huge monstrosities looking to destroy all the citizens of Sanctuary, and it's up to you and every other hero in the world to vanquish them. If you're successful, they drop some pretty amazing loot as a reward. As of right now, there are 3 different world bosses available to slay: Ashava, Avarice, and the Wandering Death. I definitely make sure to head over there as the boss fights are super enjoyable, they're not overly complicated, and they're just downright fun. Plus, it's awesome to see a bunch of other players smashing into giant monsters right alongside you. Now, we're on to the biggest and baddest of Diablo's monsters. There are currently 7 true endgame bosses that each come with varying levels of difficulty. Some you may encounter in the campaign, and then meet much later on with their uber difficulty variants, such as Indariel and Duriel. Some only become available much later in the game in World Tier 4s, such as the Beast and Ice. Each brings their own challenges and mechanics, and some will find certain bosses easier than others with their specific builds. All the bosses will require specific materials in order to summon them. These materials will be gathered by opening up Helltide chests or completing whispers for the tree, and strongholds, and sometimes randomly dropped from elite monsters out in the world. Once you have reached the highest points of your character's pinnacles, you can then summon tormented versions of these bosses, which are level 200 and have some incredibly devastating one-shot mechanics if you're not prepared, providing you with some huge milestones to strive for, which is something the initial release of this game just did not have. So it's really good to see, especially as a returning player. The final thing that's been added into Diablo 4 that I want to touch on is honestly probably the single most impactful thing that they could have added and changes the world of Diablo forever: pets. That's right, now in your adventures you can have a cute little sidekick that will follow you everywhere you go, even into the gates of hell. You can unlock them almost immediately by completing a short little quest line once you reach Kyovashad. Everyone will have access to a cute little wolf pup companion, with the snow leopard and tiger cub being restricted to those who have pre-purchased the upcoming expansion that drops in October. These little guys are more than just a cosmetic follower though, and will actually help the player out immensely by gathering up gold and other materials. This is especially helpful during big fights where certain materials may have been missed during all the chaos going on. Plus, I mean, just look how cute they are. One thing I would like to see added into Diablo 4, especially considering that Diablo 4 requires you to have constant online access, is some sort of looking for group system. I find it rather strange that they haven't implemented one into the game by now. Even just a bare bones system that allows you to quickly find other players in order to tackle some of the game's harder boss fights. Now, I'm sure there are plenty of things that I have not mentioned, mainly due to me still being a noob and not wanting to speak on things that I haven't really experienced firsthand. And granted, I know I still have a lot of things to learn about D4, so please do not take this video as a guide by any means, but what I can honestly say is that I've enjoyed the heck out of my journey so far, and I can honestly recommend the game to everyone who is either on the fence about returning or would even just like to try out Diablo 4 for the first time. The game, I believe, is in a very healthy spot with plenty of things to keep the player busy and respect their time to play, especially if that playtime is limited. I do hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you guys in the world of Sanctuary. If you did enjoy the video, please leave a like, comment, or subscribe. And please let me know all your thoughts on D4 down in the comments.